HTTP is a stateless protocol. That means that whenever you make a request to a web server and it sends a response, it completely forgets about you. All it cares about is that you made a request, it responded, and that's it. So even if you make a request a second after your first, it's not going to know who you are. It doesn't care who you are. All it cares about is that you made a request, it gave you a response, and that was it. Now you might think that, well, that's not true. Things like Amazon, Google, Facebook, Twitter, all of these things know who I am, and they know a lot about you. However, there's a difference there. Those are applications. Applications are different from the web server because they actually don't run directly on the web server. They run in some other runtime environment. PHP is a runtime environment. It's an application platform. That's one of the reasons why we have things like PHP, so that we can maintain state in our applications. Otherwise, we really wouldn't have any need to create applications, because if you can't maintain state, well, there's nothing there. So the whole reason why we have PHP, Ruby, ASP.NET, things like that, is so that we can write stateful applications that run on a web server. So when it comes to PHP, we maintain state with what's called a session, and we have to start a session in order to use a session. And really, we have to start a session on every PHP file where we want to use session data. So what is session data? Well, it can be really anything, but we typically use it to store user information like the email address and, small things like that. We don't want to store a ton of stuff in the session because it's going to consume memory and or disk space. So we want to store as little as possible. So we have to call this session start function in every PHP file where we plan on using session information. And it needs to be one of the very first things you do. Many developers will make it a habit to be the first line in a PHP file, because it depends upon your PHP configuration and even your version as to whether or not you get an error, because we want to set the session before anything is sent to the browser, including headers. Because depending upon your configuration and your version, if you try to start a session after anything is sent to the browser, then you will get an error. Now, we're not going to get an error here, but it is still a good idea to do it at the very beginning. So get in the habit of doing that. So we are going to start a session, and then we are going to use the email address to determine whether or not a user is logged in. So we're going to do this. We're going to grab the email address as well as the password, and we should validate the password. I can't stress this enough. You need to validate your inputs. However, for the sake of simplicity, we're not going to in this case. We're going to leave the email alone, but let's add a quick little to-do. Validate this because we need to. So we're going to take the email address and password, and we're going to compare it with something, because that's how you authenticate a user. You compare with our data store. Typically, that information would be inside of a database, but we don't have a database yet. So the next best thing is to store that information in a config file. So let's go to our INC folder. Let's create a new file. We'll call it config.php. And we will store our username and password here. So let's open up a PHP code block, and we're going to create what are called constants. These are very special types of variables where, well, it's constant. You assign it a value, and the value cannot change at all within that variable. That's why it's called a constant, and it's very useful for things like configuration. So we're going to create a constant variable called username. Notice that there is no $sign. It is just const, and then the text of the name that we want to use. And by convention, we use all uppercase characters for constants. That way we can visually see that, okay, this is all uppercase, that's a constant. And I'm going to use underscore notation here. You might see something like this used with no underscores, but underscores make sense here. So we're going to set this to something. Let's say that our user is going to be admin@admin.com. And then we'll set another constant for the password. So that's going to be all uppercase once again. And let's make this easy, and 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a very secure password. So these are the values that we are going to compare against. So we will compare our email and password with those values. And then based upon the result of that comparison, we will either set our session to remember the email address, or we won't. And that's how we will determine if the user is logged in. So let's write a function that's going to authenticate our user, because really we want to keep our code inside of login.php as clean as possible. So let's have a function called authenticate. We want a username, although really we want an email address, and a password. And we want to ensure that we have pulled in our config. So that's in the same path as our header. So let's go ahead and pull in config first. We'll pull in header, and that will also mean that we have that information inside of functions. So let's go to our functions, and we are going to do this. We can say if email equals, and then user underscore name, and password equals password, then we can return true or false. But we have a condition here, and this condition is going to be true or false based upon whether or not these comparisons are true and false. So instead of doing an if statement and all of that, we can just say return email is equal to username and password is equal to password. If those are true, then of course the overall result is going to be true. If one of these or both are false, then it is of course going to be false. So inside of login, we could if authenticate user. Is that what we called that? I just wrote that and I can't remember what that is. Let's do authenticate user. And then we will use that here. We will pass in our email and our password. And if this is true, then we will use our session super global. And we will set email equal to email. Otherwise, we could, set a status. We already have a status, so we could say that the provided credentials did not work. Something along those lines. And let's use double quotes there so that we don't have to do any type of escaping. And now we need to think about what we do after we authenticate the user. We set our session email value, and then we want to do something. We don't want to go back to the login page. That's kind of pointless. Instead, we want to redirect to wherever authenticated users go. So we could call that file admin.php. So to redirect, we use a header. It's called location, and you specify the location that you want to redirect to. So to set a header, we use a function aptly named header. Then we set the header. So we say location, colon, and then wherever we want to go, admin.php. Now, let me say this. This is something that we are going to do more than once as far as just redirection is concerned, not necessarily redirecting to admin.php. But if we want to redirect, then we should really write a function to encapsulate this functionality. That way, we don't have to call header, we don't have to specify location or anything like that. We could just pass in where we want to redirect, and we're good to go. So it could look like this. We'll say redirect, admin.php, and that's a whole lot easier to type. So let's do that. Let's go to our functions, and let's write a function called redirect. We will accept a URL because even if it's a file name, that is still a URL, and we will simply set that header, although we will include our URL variable, and we need to use double quotes here since we are embedding a variable. So there we go. That should redirect us. And after we redirect, let's go ahead and die. We don't want any further processing, even though there shouldn't be any further processing. But this way we can ensure that there's not, so that we redirect to admin.php and we're done with this particular request. Now, one thing we do need to consider is that redirect involves setting a header. And before we send any HTML to the browser, we need to set our headers because, well, that's just the proper thing to do. So up here on line 7, where we are including our header, let's take that out and let's do that farther down so that before we include the header, we have everything ready as far as the response is concerned, so that we set any headers that we need to and anything else. That way we are safe. And let's also do a require once for our config, just so that we have that once. And that looks good to me. So let's create a file called admin.php. And inside of this file, we will open up a code block and we need to session start. So we'll do that. And for right now, let's just echo out our email. So we will use our session super global. We will specify email. And there we go. So now let's go to the browser and let's log in. That was admin@admin.com. The user is 1234. And let's log in. We should redirect to admin.php. We do. And then we see our email address. Now, one thing to note about sessions, they are unique for each unique visitor. So we are using Chrome here. If I open up another tab and we go to admin PHP, guess what? We are still using that same session. However, if we open up an incognito session and we go to admin PHP, well, we're going to see that there is an undefined index of email. So this is not involved in that same session. If we open up Edge, go to the same URL, we're going to see the same thing, that there's an undefined index. So these sessions are unique to unique visitors, and unique visitors are unique because they are using a different browser, essentially. It's not so much that they have different IPs, it's that they are using different user agents. And you don't really have to worry about leakage. If you set anything in a session, you don't have to worry about it leaking into another session, because PHP is going to ensure that those sessions are completely separate from one another. If for some reason there is leakage, then there is a very serious problem. Okay, now what we have here inside of admin PHP, if we go to admin PHP and we are not logged in, we see this, and we don't want to see this. Instead, what we really want to do is check to see if the user is logged in, and if not, we redirect them to login PHP. So let's go to our functions. And actually, no, let's go to our login PHP. We need to copy our files here, the config and functions, and we're going to paste those in. And then we're going to write a function, or at least call a function that we will then write, called ensure user is authenticated. I like this type of function because this checks if the user is authenticated. If so, then it doesn't do anything, but if not, then it redirects them to login PHP. And we can use this at the top of every protected page so that we can always ensure that the user is logged in before there is anything displayed on the page. So inside of functions, we have our function user, or ensure user is authenticated. We will write a function that checks if the user is authenticated. So is user authenticated? And if that is actually false, so if not is user authenticated, then we will redirect. So it's a good thing we wrote that redirect, because here we are using it. And then that really is all that we need to do, because if the user is authenticated, then we don't want to do anything. But we do need this is user authenticated function. So let's go ahead and write that as well. This is going to be very simple. We are going to use is set, and we are going to check if our email key is set inside of our session. If it is, then the user is logged in. If it's not, they are not, and it's that simple. So now, whenever we go to admin PHP and we refresh, we should redirect to login PHP, and that is exactly what happened. But we also need to kind of do the opposite. If we go to login PHP and the user is logged in, we need to redirect to admin PHP. So inside of login, we are going to use that function that we just wrote, the is user authenticated. And notice that I'm using the term is. If you are going to write a function that is going to return a true or false value, then having the name represent that is very useful. Is user authenticated implies that this is going to return true or false, and it of course does. So in this case, we're going to use our trusty redirect. We will go to admin PHP, and it wouldn't hurt to die there. And really, inside of the ensure, we should die there as well. So now if we refresh while we are logged in, then that should take us to admin. If we go to admin while we are not logged in, that takes us to login. And let's go ahead and try to log in here. And 1, 2, 3, 4, and we go to admin PHP. The last thing that we need to do is log out. And this is probably the simplest thing that we will do in this whole process. So I'm going to copy the require ones for our functions, and I'm going to create a new file where we have login and admin called logout PHP. We're going to open up a code block, and the very first thing we're going to call is session start, because even though we are going to end the session, we need to start it first. And then we are going to call a function called session unset. This is going to unset all of the variables that we have set in this session. Then we destroy the session with session destroy. And then we will want to redirect someplace. So we're going to require once, where we pull in our functions. We will redirect back to login, because if we are logging out, there's really no other place that we need to go. And then we will die. So that's it. Let's go, and we will travel to logout.php. That takes us to login. Now we can test this. If we go to admin.php, well, it just redirects us back to login. And that is the behavior that we were expecting. So we now have a simple but a functional user authentication system. And we will use that in our first project, a web-based glossary.